There are dependencies that military planners prefer not to discuss publicly. They exist in classified supply chain documents, in restricted technical specifications, in the quiet calculations that determine whether weapon systems can be maintained during extended conflicts. These dependencies are not acknowledged in defense policy statements or featured in congressional testimony because admitting them would reveal vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit. The American military has such dependencies embedded throughout its most advanced weapon systems, and those dependencies run directly through Canadian territory, Canadian manufacturing facilities, and Canadian resource supplies that cannot be replaced without compromising capabilities that define American military superiority. In late 2025, Canadian defense officials began a careful process of ensuring that the United States understands exactly how deep those dependencies extend and what leverage they create. This is not about alliance relationships that can be maintained through diplomatic reassurance. This is about physical supply chains, technical expertise, and geographic advantages that give Canada the ability to affect American military readiness in ways that no adversary has achieved through direct confrontation. Most Americans believe that defense independence is a settled matter. The United States outspends the next 10 countries combined on military capabilities. American defense contractors produce the most advanced weapon systems in the world. The assumption is that American military power is self-sufficient and independent of foreign dependencies that could be exploited during conflicts or diplomatic disputes. That assumption is fundamentally incorrect. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which represents the cornerstone of American air superiority for the next 3 decades, cannot be produced without Canadian components. Specifically, the aircraft's landing gear, horizontal stabilizer assemblies, and portions of the electronic warfare systems are manufactured exclusively by Canadian aerospace companies operating facilities in Montreal, Winnipeg, and Toronto. These are not components that can be easily sourced from alternative suppliers. They are precision-engineered systems that require specialized manufacturing capabilities, decades of accumulated technical knowledge, and integration with complex supply chains that cannot be replicated quickly even with unlimited funding. The United States currently operates approximately 450 F-35 aircraft with plans to acquire a total fleet exceeding 2,400 units over the next 15 years. Each aircraft requires ongoing maintenance, component replacement, and system upgrades throughout its operational lifetime. Canadian manufacturing facilities produce approximately 15% of the components required for both new aircraft production and fleet maintenance operations. Without Canadian supply chain participation, F-35 production rates would decline by roughly 40%, while maintenance costs for existing aircraft would increase by margins that could exceed $8 billion annually, according to defense industry analyses conducted for procurement planning purposes. But the F-35 represents only the most visible example of Canadian integration into American defense production. The broader aerospace and defense sector reveals dependencies that extend across virtually every major weapons platform. The Canadian companies that produce titanium forgings for naval vessels, aluminum alloys for aircraft structures, and specialized composites for missile systems are not simply convenient suppliers that offer competitive pricing. They are single-source providers for components where no American alternative exists, without multi-year qualification processes and capital investments that would exceed $15 billion, according to Department of Defense supply chain assessments. These supply chain realities create a situation where Canadian policy decisions about export controls, production priorities, or resource allocation could directly impact American military capabilities in ways that would require years to resolve through domestic alternative development. In October 2025, the Canadian Department of National Defence announced the formation of the Defence Supply Chain Security Office, a new regulatory body tasked with reviewing all defence exports to ensure they align with Canadian security interests and do not compromise Canada's ability to meet its own defence requirements. The announcement was framed as a routine administrative reorganization focused on improving coordination between defence industry and government. But defence analysts in Washington immediately recognized the strategic implications. The Defense Supply Chain Security Office was given authority to require export licenses for defense-related components, to establish priority allocation systems that could direct production toward Canadian military needs during supply constraints, and to conduct periodic reviews of export relationships to ensure they remained aligned with Canadian national interests. These authorities created a regulatory framework where Canadian officials could restrict or condition defense exports to the United States based on diplomatic considerations, trade disputes, or evolving assessments of Canadian security priorities. The framework was structured to provide maximum flexibility for Canadian decision-makers while creating uncertainty for American defense planners who depend on predictable access to Canadian defense industrial capacity. American defense officials who contacted their Canadian counterparts seeking clarification about how the new office would operate received carefully worded responses emphasizing Canada's commitment to alliance relationships while noting that sovereign nations have obligations to ensure their own security needs are met before authorizing exports. The absence of explicit guarantees represented a significant shift from historical patterns, where Canadian defense exports to the United States were treated as essentially automatic, based on alliance relationships and integrated continental defense planning. The geographic dimensions of defense dependency extend beyond industrial supply chains to encompass territorial requirements that are even more fundamental to American military capabilities. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, cannot function without Canadian territory and Canadian military cooperation. The early warning radar systems, fighter intercept bases, and command facilities that provide the United States with the ability to detect and respond to airborne threats are located across Canadian territory because geography dictates that threats approaching from the Arctic or across the North Pacific must be detected while still over Canadian airspace. The North Warning System, which consists of 47 radar installations stretching across the Canadian Arctic from Alaska to Labrador, provides the foundational surveillance capability that allows NORAD to identify potential threats and coordinate defensive responses. Without access to Canadian territory for these installations, and without Canadian military personnel operating these systems, the United States would face detection gaps that would fundamentally compromise continental air defense. American strategic planners have understood this geographic reality since the Cold War, which is why NORAD was structured as a binational command with integrated American and Canadian forces. The assumption was that shared threat perceptions and alliance relationships would ensure continued cooperation regardless of political changes or diplomatic tensions. But in November 2025, Canadian defense officials began signaling that these historical assumptions about automatic cooperation were being reconsidered in light of changing threat assessments and evolving Canadian security priorities. The Canadian Defense Policy Update, released without advance coordination with American counterparts, outlined a framework where Canadian participation in continental defense arrangements would be evaluated based on whether those arrangements adequately reflected Canadian sovereignty concerns, provided appropriate burden sharing of costs, and aligned with Canada's independent assessments of security threats. The document specifically noted that Arctic sovereignty and security had become the primary focus of Canadian defense planning, and that all international defense cooperation would be assessed based on whether it supported or undermined Canadian Arctic security objectives. The implications were immediately clear to American officials familiar with the intricate negotiations that have historically characterized NORAD modernization efforts. Canada was serving notice that continued participation in integrated continental defense could not be taken for granted, and that American access to Canadian territory for defense installations would be subject to ongoing political assessment rather than being treated as a permanent fixture of North American security architecture. The leverage that these dependencies create became particularly evident during discussions about NORAD modernization funding. The aging radar systems and command facilities that constitute current continental air defense capabilities require replacement with next-generation technologies capable of detecting hypersonic missiles, advanced cruise missiles, and other emerging threats that existing systems cannot adequately track. Modernization cost estimates range from $35 billion to $55 billion, depending on the scope of upgrades and the technologies deployed. Historically, the United States has funded approximately 60% of NORAD costs with Canada, contributing the remaining 40%, a division that reflected the relative size of the two countries' economies and defense budgets. In December 2025, Canadian officials indicated that future cost-sharing arrangements would need to reflect the reality that NORAD infrastructure is located primarily on Canadian territory, that modernization would enhance capabilities that serve American strategic interests more directly than Canadian defense needs, and that Canadian budget priorities were shifting toward independent Arctic defense capabilities rather than integrated continental systems. The Canadian position implied that the United States might need to accept cost-sharing arrangements closer to 75-25, or even 80-20, if modernization was to proceed on timelines necessary to address emerging threats. Alternatively, Canada suggested the United States could consider funding arrangements that would provide Canadian Defense Forces with capabilities and resources that aligned with Canada's independent Arctic security priorities. American negotiators found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They could not simply proceed with NORAD modernization without Canadian agreement because the systems being deployed would be located on Canadian territory. They could not threaten to withdraw from NORAD because continental air defense is not optional for American security. And they could not offer alternative arrangements that bypassed Canadian territory because geography makes that impossible. The leverage belonged entirely to Canada, and Canadian officials were making deliberate use of that leverage to reshape defense relationships that had historically been structured around American priorities and American assumptions about Canadian compliance. The Arctic dimension of Canadian defense leverage extends beyond NORAD to encompass broader questions about military access, operational freedom, and control over territory that is becoming increasingly central to great power competition. Climate change is transforming the Arctic from a frozen barrier that limited military activity to an increasingly accessible region, where naval operations, resource competition, and territorial disputes are creating new security challenges. The Northwest Passage, which runs through Canadian Arctic waters, is becoming navigable for extended periods, creating the possibility that it could serve as a significant commercial shipping route and a potential theater for naval competition. The United States has long maintained that the Northwest Passage constitutes international waters where foreign vessels, including military ships, have the right of transit passage. Canada has consistently asserted that the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian internal waters where Canadian sovereignty is absolute and where foreign vessels require Canadian permission for transit. This legal dispute remained largely theoretical for decades because ice conditions made regular transit impossible regardless of legal interpretations. But as climate change extends the ice-free season, the dispute is becoming operationally significant. In January 2026, the Canadian government announced plans to establish permanent military installations at strategic locations along the Northwest Passage, including upgraded facilities at Resolute Bay and new installations at key choke points where Canadian forces could monitor and control vessel traffic through Arctic waters. The announcement was accompanied by increased Royal Canadian Navy patrols using the new Arctic and offshore patrol ships that had entered service specifically to enhance Canadian presence in northern waters. Canadian officials made clear that foreign military vessels, including those of the United States, would be expected to request permission for transit through the Northwest Passage and to accept Canadian monitoring and control during any approved transits. American naval planners who had assumed they could operate freely in Arctic waters as ice conditions improved suddenly faced the prospect that Canadian assertion of sovereignty could restrict American naval access to regions that are becoming strategically important for monitoring Russian and Chinese Arctic activities. The diplomatic tensions created by this situation were complicated by the fact that publicly challenging Canadian sovereignty claims would undermine the broader principle of territorial sovereignty that the United States seeks to uphold in other maritime disputes, particularly those involving China's expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea. American military leadership found themselves in a strategic bind. They needed access to Arctic waters for operational purposes. They needed Canadian cooperation for continental defense, but they could not openly challenge Canadian sovereignty claims without undermining their own positions in other maritime disputes. The resource dimension of defense dependency adds another layer of leverage that Canadian officials were beginning to exploit strategically. Modern weapon systems require extraordinary quantities of specialized materials that are increasingly difficult to source from politically stable suppliers. Rare earth elements, which are essential for precision-guided munitions, advanced radar systems, and fighter aircraft electronics, are currently produced primarily in China. The United States has minimal domestic rare earth production capacity and has been attempting for years to develop alternative supply chains that would reduce dependence on Chinese suppliers. Canada possesses significant rare earth deposits and has the technological capability to develop processing facilities that could supply American defense needs. But developing those capabilities requires substantial investment and multi-year development timelines. And Canadian officials have made clear that any such development would occur on terms that prioritize Canadian economic benefits and Canadian control over export decisions. In February 2026, the Canadian government announced a critical mineral strategy that established federal control over rare earth and strategic mineral development, requiring companies developing these resources to prioritize domestic processing and to obtain export licenses before shipping materials to foreign customers, including the United States. The strategy created a framework where American defense contractors seeking access to Canadian rare earth elements would need to negotiate with Canadian government authorities rather than simply purchasing from private companies. Those negotiations would inevitably involve discussions about technology sharing, domestic manufacturing requirements, and Canadian participation in defense programs that would give Canada leverage over American military capabilities. American defense planners recognized that alternative sources for rare earth elements were limited to countries like China, Russia, or politically unstable regions where supply security could not be assured. Canada was offering access to critical materials, but on terms that would give Canadian officials significant influence over American defense industrial capabilities. The cybersecurity dimension of defense integration created yet another area where Canadian decisions could impact American military capabilities. Modern weapon systems are heavily dependent on software, networked communications, and digital integration that requires extensive cybersecurity measures to protect against adversary interference. Canadian cybersecurity firms have developed specialized capabilities in protecting defense systems against sophisticated cyber threats. Several of these firms hold contracts with the U.S. Department of Defense to provide security for critical weapon systems and command networks. The expertise required for this work cannot be easily replicated because it involves detailed knowledge of specific systems, years of security clearance investigations for personnel, and trusted relationships with defense agencies that take decades to establish. In March 2026, Canadian officials implemented new data sovereignty regulations requiring that any cybersecurity work involving Canadian personnel or Canadian companies be conducted under legal frameworks that recognize Canadian jurisdiction over data and intellectual property, even when the work involved American defense systems. The regulations created situations where American defense agencies would need to accept Canadian legal oversight of cybersecurity operations or find alternative providers who lacked the specialized expertise that Canadian firms had developed through years of classified work with American weapon systems. The cumulative effect of these dependencies across industrial supply chains, geographic requirements, resource access, and technical expertise created a situation where Canadian policy decisions could affect American military readiness in ways that would require years or decades to resolve through alternative arrangements. American defense planners who conducted comprehensive supply chain reviews in late 2025 and early 2026 produced classified assessments that reportedly concluded that eliminating Canadian dependencies from American weapon systems would require investment exceeding $200 billion and timelines extending beyond 15 years for complete substitution of Canadian components, facilities, and expertise. During that transition period, American military capabilities would be vulnerable to Canadian policy changes, export restrictions, or resource allocation decisions that prioritize Canadian interests over American defense requirements. The political implications of these findings were profound. The United States could not credibly threaten military action or severe economic pressure against a country that was embedded so deeply in American defense capabilities that disrupting the relationship would compromise American military readiness more severely than any adversary had achieved through direct confrontation. Canadian officials understood this dynamic and were carefully exploiting it to reshape defense relationships that had historically been structured around American dominance and Canadian subordination. The leverage created by defense dependencies gave Canada the ability to demand changes in cost-sharing arrangements, technology transfer agreements, resource access terms, and Arctic sovereignty recognition that the United States would have rejected under normal circumstances. But circumstances were not normal. The United States needed Canadian cooperation for continental defense. American weapons systems depended on Canadian components. American military operations required access to Canadian territory. And American defense planning had to account for the reality that Canada now possessed leverage that could not be eliminated through policy changes or budget increases. This is not a temporary situation that will resolve when political tensions ease. These dependencies are embedded in infrastructure that took decades to build, in supply chains that cannot be quickly reconfigured, and in geographic realities that cannot be changed through engineering or diplomacy,